Stitches to you all. Look, I want to get started tonight, and this is kind of a basic class that I teach at most of the events, but in teaching digitizing, I want to initially simplify the process for everyone. I've always felt that with most software, with most educational processes in embroidery, they've made the process too difficult. If you understand what I'm about to tell you, it's going to greatly simplify embroidery. First of all, let me start off by saying that embroidery, folks, is nothing more than three defined stitch types. We use running stitches in embroidery. Running stitches are what we see as what we call underlay. Underlay are the stitches underneath the top stitches. They give loft to your embroidery designs. Also, all fine detail work is done with the running stitch. Running stitches have rules. In fact, each stitch types have rules, very simple rules. My opinion is if you understand the rules to the different stitch types in embroidery, or the three stitch types in embroidery, my gosh, you can run it all day without hardly breaking a thread. So I'm going to take you initially through the rules to the different stitch types, or the three stitch types in embroidery. The pull and push controls on it, the stitch length, the spacing, the opening size, and such. I'm also going to share and show you tonight that embroidery is also combinations of stitches. What I mean by that are like background fill stitches next to satin stitch borders. I'll bring something up on the screen in just a second, but I wanted to start with a little bit of a comment. In 100% of the embroidery process, folks, embroidery is nothing more than 6 possible combinations of stitches, and I'll run through that. My point is this. Designs change like night and day in the embroidery process. We may one day be digitizing a corporate logo. We may be digitizing a duck or a dog or a house. The fact is that embroidery is repetitive. While designs change like night and day, the stitches and their inherent reaction and interaction to each other never changes. It so simplifies embroidery. Let's go ahead and get started. And the first thing I want to bring up is the running stitch, okay? Running stitches have rules, folks, okay? The first rule to the running stitch, and I'm going to go ahead and mark the needle penetration points on this design. And you know what? As I go through this, I'm also going to point out some of the features in the software that help control, or that control aspects of these rules. But the first rule to the running stitch is stitch length. Length equals loft. There's a range of length for the running stitch. If you want a running stitch to show, the stitch length is 1 to 4 millimeters in length. Now, where do I use stitch lengths of 1 millimeters? Where do I use stitch lengths of 4 millimeters and such? First of all, in minute detail, because with a running stitch, one can achieve minute embroidery detail. The minimal stitch length that I will normally use for minute detail is 1 millimeter. Very seldom do we go below 1 millimeter in length. Let me explain. Again, length equals loft. From needle penetration to needle penetration, one needs sufficient length because one is basically floating the stitch on top of the base fabric. Stitches laid less than 1 millimeter in length, and you'll see that I have a couple transitional stitches here from the A into the S. Those are stitches that hide the running stitch. Stitch length laid below 1 millimeter in length drive the stitches down into the fabric. In fact, that's one of the neatest little tricks. One of the tricks that I do with minute lettering is when I'm transcending from one letter, let's say, to another, I drop tiny little stitches. If I mark the length on this, you'll see that my stitch length ranges from about 2 to 4/10 of a millimeter in length. Why? Again, because stitch lengths laid less than 1 millimeter in length drive down into the fabric, and you very seldom see them. That's how we hide running stitches. When we lay them less than 1 millimeter, they're driven down into the fabric, you don't see them. So the first rule to the running stitch is proper stitch length. 1 millimeter being the minimum. I use 1 millimeter for minute detail. When I'm outlining around an eyeball, when I'm doing minute lettering, the lettering in this case here is 3 millimeter tall lettering. So the lengths of these stitches equate to about 1, 1.5, 1.7 or so millimeters in length. Length equals loft. Where do I use stitch lengths of 2, 3 millimeters? You use them for underlay, underneath like your lettering. That's why when one goes into the running stitch, into the software, and you'll see up here, the default value is 3 millimeters. That's a stitch length that we utilize for underlay. That's a stitch that we utilize with sufficient length to show. Once again, I can't say it enough. Length equals loft. The first rule to the running stitch is length. Now, the second rule to the running stitch is proper opening size. The fact is that when we're surrounding like small letter A's, R's, E's, P's, many times the opening size closes. The smallest opening size one can achieve with a running stitch is 0.8 to 1 millimeter. So before one digitizes any small structure, just always go, example here in this letter A, measure across the top of this letter A. Excuse me, let me grab the ruler. Measure across the opening here at the crossbar of the letter A, 1.4 millimeters. That's telling you it's going to stay open. If you ever measure an opening size smaller than 0.8 to 1 millimeter, it's telling you that opening is going to close. Now, what do we do when we measure an opening smaller than 0.8 to 1 millimeter? Well, in the case of a letter A, you know what? Drop the crossbar. Go into the letter or go into the structure and measure an area where it is more than 0.8 to 1 millimeter in size, and that's where you would drop the stitch, no matter what your artwork may look like. Just drop the line a little bit, okay? Just drop it down till you get to a spacing of greater than 0.8 to 1 millimeter, and the opening will always stay open. First rule is length. Second rule is opening size. The third rule is spacing. When one has two lines of a running stitch, realize thread has weight. If I make it look like thread has weight, measurable weight. Spacing between two lines that go in the same direction, example, a letter I next to a letter I, in this case the U next to the letter R, you need the proper space in between those running stitches. The proper spacing, okay, so that this area in between doesn't close up, is also 0.8 to 1 millimeter in spacing. If one does not have 0.8 to 1 millimeter in spacing in between those lines, you're going to close the opening in that area. Example, two letter I's, you won't see the gap in between. Thread has weight, measurable weight. 40 weight thread measures about 0.4 of a millimeter in weight. Thereby a double run stitch fills about 0.8 of a millimeter. We need that same weight or spacing or a little greater to ensure the opening size. So the first rule to the running stitch is proper stitch length. The second rule to the running stitch is proper opening size, 0.8 to 1 millimeter. The third rule to the running stitch is proper spacing. Those are the rules, and the only rules to the running stitch: length, spacing, and opening size, okay? And that's all there is with the running stitch. Let's move on to the satin stitch. First of all, the first rule of a satin stitch, and I'm going to go ahead and close this design down now. I've got a lot of stuff open. But the first rule to a satin stitch is proper width, all right? Look, things happen on an embroidery machine. We eat garments. I explain in the classes that I give, the greatest reason why we eat garments is normally in the execution of a satin stitch made too narrow, okay? There are two constants in the embroidery process. The first constant is called pull. The letter I stitches left to right. The letter I will always run narrower than the size that you created, okay? That constant is called pull. Second constant in embroidery is called push. The letter I will also grow taller at the top and the bottom, okay? It's based on thread weight and density. Density is how close we put our stitches together in embroidery design. Again, thread has weight. Put your stitches too close together in an embroidery design, the weight of the thread builds up upon each other, forces the letter I to be taller at the top and the bottom. Because of the width issue, because of pull, the minimum width of a satin stitch in embroidery is 1.4 millimeters. The natural pull, and I'm going to give you some rules now, the natural pull of a satin stitch is 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter, meaning no matter how wide you make a satin stitch, whether you make it 1.4 millimeters, 2 millimeters wide, 4 millimeters wide, 6 millimeters wide. The natural pull of that satin stitch is 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter wide. The natural push of a satin stitch is also 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter wide. So example, in the software, when one creates a satin stitch, and I'll do one here with the classic satin, set it. You know what? Let me go ahead and grab this satin. I'm just going to change the color on it. I apologize for that. And I'm going to select it. Whenever you're doing satin stitching within the software and you're digitizing, come up here to the properties box and go into your pull and push. Now look, while we do control pull and push in the Save to Sew feature to some extent, pull and push and in Save to Sew can only be controlled to so many aspects. I find it better that when one digitizes, one understands the natural pull and the push of a satin, of a fill stitch and such. Set the parameters within the software as one digitizes. So whenever you digitize a satin stitch within the software, go into your pull compensation, okay? Set an absolute value on both sides of that satin stitch of 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter. In the push compensation, on both sides of the satin stitch, and do this on both sides of the satin stitch, all right? I want you to set a compensation value of 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter. The natural pull of a satin stitch is 2 to 3/10. The natural push of a satin stitch is 2 to 3/10. So when I hit apply, what's taken place is the satin stitch has gotten wider, 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter on both sides. On the top and the bottom, it's gotten 2 to 3/10 shorter. We do that to control the push. We control the push compensation. On the left and the right, we control the pull compensation. Look, folks, this is really quite amazing. Floriani software is the only software in the world that gives you absolute control of your pull and your push. Prior to a software like this being developed, it had to be done in digitizing. The point is this, with Floriani software, one can digitize more perfectly and allow the software to do the primary distortion values. Just simply come into your pull and push compensation, set an absolute value of pull to 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter, an absolute value of push compensation to 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter, and you will be emulating a master digitizer. What a master digitizer understands initially with the satin stitch is proper width. The minimal width of a satin stitch digitized size is 1.4 millimeters. When you digitize a satin stitch 1.4 millimeters, what you're going to end up with is a satin stitch 0.8 to 1 millimeter in width, finished on the garment. So if I want a satin stitch 1.4 millimeters, I'm actually going to digitize it 1.8 millimeters in width. Why? Because I exceed the satin stitch on the left and the right 2 to 3/10. Realize in digitizing we have digitized size and finished size. They're two very different things. Because of the constants of pull and push, they're two very different things. So your satin stitching, always add pull compensation of 2 to 3/10, always add push compensation to 2 to 3/10. The minimal width of a satin stitch is 1.4 millimeters. I'm going to give you all a little trick. In my digitizing, when I digitize, I go under Tools and I go under General Options. Set your grid to 1.4 millimeters square, all right? The grid can be a very, very useful tool. When you have a grid set to 1.4 millimeters square, and I'll go ahead and bring the grid up, what you have behind you as you digitize now is an exacting frame of reference to the proper width of a satin stitch, no matter what zoom scale you're on. Okay, if I'm digitizing and I zoomed in to a design this much, you know what I have on the screen here? I never make my satin stitching narrower than this box behind me, okay? If I zoom in, see how much bigger the box got? But you know what, folks? The box is still 1.4 millimeters square. So if I'm now digitizing and I've zoomed in this amount of my design, I never make my satin stitching narrower once again. than the box behind me. The grid set to 1.4 millimeters is such a fabulous tool for setting the exacting width, minimal width of a satin stitch in embroidery. If you keep the satin stitches 1.4 wider, you'll never eat another garment based on the width issue of the satin stitch. First rule in satin stitching is proper width. The second rule in the satin stitch is angle. And there's two ways that we go around a corner in the embroidery process, how we go around a turn. Basically, there's the wrong way and what I call the right way. What you see over here on the left is the wrong way. What a digitizer has done here, he or she, is they basically come from a straight element of stitching into a curved element of stitching back into a straight element of stitching. You're forcing the same amount of stitching from here to here as you have from here to here. I say in all of my classes, I have a very technical term for this type of cornering. I call it the ka-chunk stitch, because you hear it on your machine. It goes around the turn, and the machine goes ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. Sound effects are very important in my classes that I teach online or live. Look, this is also what causes bird nesting. This can cause bird nesting. This can also pop holes in your garment. It's a hard turn. The proper way to corner in the embroidery process is what we simply call angle in and angle out. You basically come into the corner at the same relative angle of the corner, come out of the corner at the same relative angle of the corner. Now look, there's two values to the software really that are amazing. First of all, if you're running an embroidery design, okay, and you know what, to get just back to the width, one of the aspects that I teach when I teach reading an embroidery design is that when you bring a design up on your screen, the first thing to do, look for the skinniest satin stitch in the design and measure the width. If it's under 1.4 millimeters, you know what? Select it and add a little width to that structure. Okay, add a little width to that satin stitch. Get the satin stitch to 1.4, you'll never eat another garment. But also look at designs that you're going to run and how it goes around a corner. Because if this is what you see, it's telling you there's a good chance you're going to bird nest. If you ever see this in an embroidery design, and look, even some of our keyboard lettering will corner like this. If you see it, and I'll show you in keyboard lettering, but if you see this in an embroidery design, simply select the structure, go to the third icon down called shape, because you now have angle lines that are generated. I'll evaporate the stitches. You see the straight, you see the angle, you see the straight. Simply grab this angle line here and pull it down. You have a frame of reference, you're looking at the corner. You don't even have to be exact, just get close to it. Grab this angle line and pull it over. Again, you're looking at the angle of the corner. I'll bring the stitches back up. Here's what I have, the straight, the angle, and the straight. I've moved two angle lines, right click, left click. You'll never bird nest again. Now, that's when you're running an embroidery design that's already been digitized. The fact is, though, when you're working within Floriani software, you don't really have to worry about that. There are two types of satin stitches within the software. There's an input satin path. And an input satin path, one is going to define, and I'll just make a letter I, the left side of the letter I, right-click to get over to the right side of the letter I. I'm now on the bottom right. I left-click at the top of the letter I right-click, and it generates the satin stitch. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. The other form of satin stitching is called a classic satin, where to do a letter I, one is going point, counterpoint, and then we can come to the bottom, point, counterpoint. I'm working left to right or right to left. Well, the fact is that when I am digitizing, we developed the classic satin because initially in the software, when we used the satin path used to do angles. And I'll go ahead and undo this. It used to do angles more like this or corners like this. But we somewhat changed the logic on the input satin path. So I find 90% of the time or more, I'm now using the satin path as opposed to the classic satin. Because watch when I make a letter I with the input satin path. Click on your input satin path. I'm going to add another color down here, and I'll just grab another color. And I'm going to make a letter L, and I'm going to define the left side of the letter L, and now the bottom of the letter L. Right-click to get over to the other side, and now I'm going to define the other side of the letter L. Well, the logic that's now being used, I'm going to define this side all with left clicks and then a right click. And you see how wonderfully beautiful it angles in and angles out of the corner. That's because the logic in how we make a turn in Floriani software is based on something we call fractional spacing. Basically what the software is trying to do, it's trying to maintain the same distance on this side of the letter L as it's maintained or as it has on this side of the letter L. What that does is it forces the corner. So in reality, this rule of proper angles is overcome by the software within itself. As long as you're using an input satin path for your satin stitch structures, you're going to have the proper angles inside and outside of the corner. If you choose to use the classic satin, I'm going to go ahead and digitize right on this same letter with it. What you're going to have to do is you are the angle. So as I point, counterpoint, you now have to come in and point, counterpoint. You see you are the angle. Classic satin was developed for more of an experienced digitizer who's done it a long time, who understands the angles of embroidery. Once again, once we changed the logic, I really could have done away with it, but I left it in there because I still like to use the classic satin. I was brought up and I digitized for 30 years with point counterpoint. But I'll tell you, because of the technique we now utilize for the logic of making corners, I now use the input satin path. The second rule, the first rule is width. The second rule is proper angle. The third rule to the satin stitch is proper density, all right? And you know what? What I'm going to bring up is a density chart for satin stitches. Excuse me, that is my exercise 4 in the software. You know what? I have it down here. I apologize. I should have had this already open up. Let me go into my design library. Let me pull it in. This is a density chart with satin stitches. Basically what a density chart is, and now once again, Save to Sew to some extent supersedes density in satin stitches, but the fact is that there's a general rule with density in satin stitching. The narrower the satin stitch, the lighter the density. The wider the satin stitch, the tighter the density. The narrower the lighter, the wider the tighter. Basically, what you're looking at here, again, is a density chart. What I've done is I've started up here from left to right with satin stitching starting at, again, 1.4 millimeters in width, all right? Then I've applied different densities to it. Now, let me explain density. Density, folks, is nothing more than spacing in between stitches. So if I measure the density here, you'll see I've started with a 0.4 density. My next row over is a 0.5 density, and so on. I work from left to right, a series of satin stitches 1.4 millimeters wide, and I keep going up one whole number. The fact is even within a 40 weight thread, what you'll find is that different threads, even though they're all 40 weight, darker threads tend to run a little lighter than lighter thread. Peaches and yellows and such are what I call puff colors. They take different densities, all right? So when I'm working with lighter yarns, let's say yellows and peaches on whites, many times you can go to like a 0.5, 0.6 density with narrower satin stitches. As we go wider with our satin stitches, you're going to tighten the density, okay? Normally, for satin stitching that range 5, 6 millimeters in width, your density is going to be about a 0.4. For satin stitches starting at about 1.4 millimeters, you're going to be at a 0.5, 0.6. Density charts are nothing more than a series of letter I's that range for me 1.4, then I go 1.6 millimeters in width, 1.8 millimeters in width, 2 millimeters, 3 millimeters, 4, 5, 6, and 7. That is the range of a satin stitch. Satin stitches also have rule when we get to the width of what is the maximum width of a satin stitch. Whenever you measure a piece of embroidery or a design you're about to run, if something measures from 1 millimeter to about 7, almost 8 millimeters in width, it's telling you a satin stitch. Satin stitches have ranges of width. The first rule is width. The second rule is angle. The third rule is density. There's 2 more rules to the satin stitch. The next rule to the satin stitch, once again, is opening size. When we do satin stitches, again, A's, R's, P's, E's tend to close, okay? The smallest opening size one can achieve while using satin stitches is, once again, 8/10 to 1 millimeter. Go right above, like on a letter A, the opening, right at the cross here, measure the opening size. If it's smaller than 8/10 to 1 millimeter, it's telling you before you ever digitized it, it's going to close, okay? If it's greater than 8/10 to 1 millimeter, it's telling you it's going to stay open. And the final rule to the satin stitch is spacing. When one is making, again, like two letter I's next to each other, two satin stitches too close to each other forms a cut line. You'll actually cut the material, and I'm talking about this area right here. So the proper spacing for satin stitching, once again, is 8/10 to 1 millimeter. If you have two satin stitches going in the same linear direction, an I next to an I, an A next to a V, an M next to an N, any two lines going in the same linear direction, make sure you have the proper spacing in between your satin stitches. The rules to the satin stitch, again, proper width, proper angle, proper density, proper opening size, and proper spacing. And the third and final stitch type with very, very simple rules is the fill stitch. Now again, satin stitches, pull and push 2 to 3/10, pull, 2 to 3/10 push. And the final stitch is a fill stitch. A fill stitch has very, very simple rules. All you really have to understand about a fill stitch is, first of all, stitch length. The proper stitch length in a fill stitch has a range. It's from 3 to 5 millimeters, in my opinion. So when one goes into a fill stitch, you'll see that Floriani software has a default value of 3 millimeters in stitch length. Let me give you an example. If you are going to stitch on top of the fill stitch, and I'll go ahead and, you know what, I'm just going to put an example, a letter T, on top of this fill stitch. We'll go ahead and make a letter T, apply it. Oops, excuse me, I want a cap, I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm stitching on top of the fill stitch. Let's go ahead and change that color. The fact is that if you are stitching on top of a fill, the most important thing to really remember is stitch direction. The fill stitch in this case is going left to right. The stitches that are going up here in the satin stitch going up and down, if you have a stitch length greater than 3 millimeters, you're going to pull a gap in the fill, and you'll actually see the base material through the fill. If you're going to stitch on top of a fill stitch, the proper stitch length in that fill stitch is 3 millimeters in length. Now, if I'm doing a fill stitch and I've got nothing going on top of it, I will actually go into that fill stitch and I will set a stitch length. Let me get rid of that. I will set a stitch length of 5 millimeters. Okay, now if you look up here, I've got 6,400 stitches in that fill. Setting a stitch length to 5 millimeters and applying it, I just dropped it down more than 2,000 stitches, okay? If one is running an embroidery business, that's called stitch consciousness. Reducing the stitch count enhances the runnability and the amount of runs one can get in an hour. Also, the effect, the look, is really no different, okay? It yields basically the same look. You've just done it with a lot less stitches. If you're stitching on top of a fill stitch, your stitch length can be 5 millimeters. If you're not stitching on top, 5 millimeters. If you're stitching on top, 3 millimeters is the stitch length. The proper density for a fill stitch with 40 weight thread is a 0.4 density. But I also do density charts with fill stitches. What I basically do is make a series of boxes, a couple inches wide, and I set different densities. I start with a 0.4, I go to a 0.5, a 0.6, a 0.7. Different densities yield different effects. Open fills allowing the material to come through many times can create some magnificent effects. So make a density chart. And then the final rule, so the first rule really is stitch length. Second rule in the fill stitch is density. And the third and final rule to the fill stitches are the pull and the push. Once again, in Floriani software, digitize your fills perfectly. Doesn't matter anymore. Whether you're using the magic wand or you're digitizing in a traditional manner, digitize them perfectly because the entire process is once again controlled within your pull and push. So click on your fill. In the properties box, click on your pull and your push. The natural pull of a fill stitch in embroidery, folks, on both sides set an absolute value of 5/10 of a millimeter. In my book, I write 3 to 5/10. Stabilize absolutely perfectly. It's more like 3/10. If you're not using fusible stabilizers, probably 5/10. So you have a little bit of a range. The natural push of a fill stitch in embroidery is also 3 to 5/10. So set your pull and your push to 3 to 5/10. And then when you apply it, basically what's taking place, and I'll go ahead and undo that, and then we'll redo that. Excuse me. We got to select it first. Come into pull, 5/10, 5/10, and apply it. We got 5/10 wider. We got 3/10 narrower at the top and the bottom. The fill will grow 3 to 5/10 at the top and the bottom based on thread weight and density. It's going to pull on both sides 3 to 5/10. The rules to the stitch types are nothing more than that. In a running stitch, it's length, it's spacing, it's opening size. In a satin stitch, it's width, it's angle, it's density, it's opening size, and it's spacing. In a fill stitch, it's length, it's density, it's pull, and it's push. Let's talk about the 6 combinations of stitches. In 100% of embroidery, folks, there are 6 possible combinations of stitches in the embroidery process, and this simplifies it again so greatly. And I'm going to bring up a series of designs at the end, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. But the 6 combinations in embroidery are fill stitches next to fill stitches. Fill stitches next to fill stitches, folks, have basically one primary rule, and that's a rule of overlapping. When one stitch type is placed next to another stitch type, the stitch needs to overlap into the other stitch so that we do not get a separation in between. So in digitizing, there are rules of overlapping, okay? Fill stitch next to a fill stitch is the first combination of stitches in embroidery. The second combination of stitches in embroidery are fill stitches next to satin stitches. Put a fill stitch next to a satin stitch, there's a rule of an overlap. There's also a push rule. You then have fill stitches next to running stitches. They have a rule of an overlap and a rule of a push rule. You then have satin stitches next to satin stitches, which have a rule of an overlap, and certainly always in satin stitching a rule of push. You then have satin stitches next to running stitches, and then we have running stitches next to running stitches. In 100% of embroidery that you will ever digitize, you only have 6 possible combinations of stitches. Let me just very simply give you the rules. When you put a fill stitch next to another fill stitch, the critical aspect is the junction point. When you put that fill stitch next to that fill stitch, the minimum overlap is 1 millimeter or more. As you digitize and you overlap a millimeter or more, you're guaranteeing you won't get separation in between. Now, once again, if you digitize 2 fills and you do no overlapping, select the 1 fill, go into your pull compensation, and you can control that aspect right here just by putting in an absolute value of 1. Greater than 1 is even better. When I digitize, I basically double those numbers. My normal overlap is about 2 millimeters when I put a fill stitch next to another fill stitch. I call that flaw factor. Flaw factor induces the fact, or it amplifies the fact, that you may not have even stabilized correctly, and you've got a very good chance that it's still going to line up. If you ever look at a design and you measure an overlap, a design you're going to run, and it's less than 1 millimeter, in Floriani software, simply select it. As you come down along, in this case, the left side of this structure, you're going to see a black square. If it were a shape fill, you'd see multiple black squares. Get on top of it. You've got 2 little arrows, left click, and just increase the overlap. The more an embroidery design is distorted, the more the stitch types are overlapped, the more forgiving it is. It's called flaw factor. A fill stitch next to a fill stitch has an overlap of 1 millimeter or more. Now, you'll see that I have 2 fills going different directions here. At the junction point, I have an overlap of 1 millimeter. On this top fill, which is going up and down, the artwork, my artwork were 2 fill stitches exactly the same size. But because these stitches are going up and down, I actually went outside of the line, or I induced pull of 5/10 of a millimeter. So this fill is certainly taller than the fill on the right. The fill on the right, going left to right, gets narrower, but actually grows in height. How much? 3 to 5/10 of a millimeter. So when you have 2 fills going opposite directions, you will have a height differential when you digitize of about 8/10 to 1 millimeter. Why? Because this fill is going to push up 3 to 5/10 of a millimeter. This fill is going to pull down 3 to 5/10 of a millimeter. Run a design like this, you know what you're going to have? You're going to have 2 fills exactly the same height. Pull and push is everything in the embroidery process. Fill next to a fill is an overlap of 1 millimeter or more. Fill stitch next to a satin stitch. The minimal overlap of a fill stitch next to a satin stitch when digitized is once again 1 millimeter or more. So my fill is going left to right. On the left and the right, I'm overlapped into that satin. In this case, 2. The minimal overlap is 1 or more. Now, here are at junctions in the push direction. There's 0 overlap. Why? Because this fill stitch is going to grow 3 to 5/10 of a millimeter in height. So set your push to 3 to 5/10, and what you'll see is that you have no overlap. It's going to literally push up into that satin stitch. Guaranteed, you will not have a gap between this. That push is going to push right up. The natural pull, 3 to 5/10. The natural push, 3 to 5/10 in a fill next to a satin stitch. You then have fill stitches next to running stitches. When you put a fill stitch next to a running stitch, the proper overlap, in my book, I write 3 to 5/10 of a millimeter. So if I measure this one, you'll see I'm right at 3/10 of a millimeter. I've kind of changed it now as I teach it because machines run a little faster than when I wrote my book. And I tell people when you put your fill stitch next to that running stitch, actually go 5/10 of a millimeter. So once again, I could select that fill. I could come down along the left side and look for that little black square and pull it a little deeper if I wanted to increase the overlap. But you know what? Once again, the absolute magnificence in the software is our absolute value of pull. I measured it. It was 3. Simply select it, select my absolute value, add 2 more, and you know what? Now I've got 5/10 of a millimeter. The natural pull of a fill stitch is 5/10. At the top and the bottom of this fill, you'll see a gap between the fill stitch and the running stitch line. That's because of push. Once again, the natural push of a fill stitch is 3 to 5/10 of a millimeter. That's the gap that I'm going to leave. That fill stitch is going to push right up there, 3 to 5/10. Now, let me explain something and why I'm going over this. In the save to sew function within the software, there's a certain amount of controls that we can apply to it. The controls basically, because in most cases when you digitize, you're putting fills next to satin stitches. So save to sew is developed for fills in most cases next to satin stitches. The deviation is when you're putting fills or satin stitches next to run stitches because the overlap is minimized. Now, there's actually 2 things that will control that. If you're digitizing a design that has fills next to running stitches and you go into save to sew, the choice in save to sew, because you have different materials or different functions. I didn't digitize, I digitized, and Magic Wand. Magic Wand is actually telling the software I have no overlap and increases the overlap the maximum amount. I digitize actually means that I'm overlapped, but not quite enough. It needs a little more overlap. When you put into that save to sew feature, I didn't digitize, you're actually telling an existing or a stock embroidery design that it has proper overlaps. But you know what? If you were to digitize a perfect running stitch next to a fill stitch with no overlap, my choice would always be I didn't digitize. Let me just explain. I don't want to confuse anyone, but I didn't digitize has the lesser amounts of overlaps added into it. So where Magic Wand has an overlap of, let's say, 1 millimeter added to it in the pull compensation, if I didn't digitize, The overlap that's been added is about 3 to 5 tenths. So if I were digitizing a design, fill stitches or satin stitches with running stitches, in Save to Sew, choose I didn't digitize. And that's only if you don't do your distortion values when you digitize. My opinion is when you digitize, do your distortion values. That way when you go to Save to Sew, if you digitize it with the proper distortion values, when you go into Save to Sew, you would turn off the compensation value of it because you've already compensated. Master digitizers compensate as they digitize. A fill next to a running stitch has an overlap of 5/10 of a millimeter pull, 3 to 5/10 of a millimeter push, all controlled in your pull and push up in the properties box here. There's only a couple more. Satin stitches next to satin stitches have a rule of an overlap. When you put a satin stitch next to a satin stitch in embroidery, the minimal overlap is once again 1 millimeter or more, and then with 2 letter I's next to each other, we're still going to add pull compensation of 2 to 3 tenths on the outsides. Now, let me explain something else about the software. One of the great things with the software is that when you do a satin stitch, because realize here, we have a satin stitch on this side that needs to overlap 2 to 3 tenths on the left side, a satin stitch here on the right side that needs to overlap 2 to 3 tenths, allowing for the natural pull. But at the junction point, we need an overlap of a millimeter or more. You have that absolute control because you have, in your pull compensation, you have, you have first side, second side, one being left, one being right, and then you have the junction point, which you can also control at a millimeter. So you have absolute control. Do you realize what I'm saying? You can go in and set the value to one side, set the value to the other side, and then set the junction point value. That is amazing in the software. And then, of course, you would set your push control at 2 to 3 tenths of a millimeter for those satins. When you put a satin next to another satin, you have an overlap of a millimeter or more. We then have satin stitches next to running stitches. When you put a satin stitch next to a running stitch, the satin stitch needs to exceed the running stitch 2 to 3 tenths of a millimeter in the pull direction. In the push direction at the top and the bottom, you leave a gap of, again, 2 to 3 tenths of a millimeter. And then the final rule are running stitches next to running stitches. Running stitches next to running stitches is more of a spacing issue. What I will share with you is that when you put running stitches next to running stitches, if you're doing it in a manual basis, the minimum spacing in between running stitches next to running stitches, and I'll go ahead and measure it, is 4/10 of a millimeter. Why? Because the thread in itself weighs that much, so I leave gapping of about 4/10 of a millimeter when I do it manual. The thread itself will fill that gapping. This little exercise here, I'm actually starting at about 3 to 4/10 and then going wider and wider and wider and wider. Again, just showing you how manually with a running stitch next to a running stitch you can create different effects. Think about embroidery, and let's look at a couple of designs. You bring a design up. You know what? I always bring this up, so let's bring this up. You bring a design up. You know what? The fact is, again, 3 stitch types with rules of length, spacing, opening size, density, angles, and 6 combinations of stitches with rules of pull and push and overlap. Let me explain something, folks. What I just shared with you is 85% of the digitizing process. What every master digitizer shares are proper widths, proper angles, proper spacing, proper opening size, proper densities, and proper overlaps, okay? That's what master digitizers share. I want to explain the digitizing sequence next, but before I do that, Kathy, if there are any questions at this point, I'm going to open it up to a few questions. If not, I'll go ahead and proceed, but let's see what you got for me.
Well, first of all, Walter, I want to tell everybody that your book is available. It's called Destined to Digitize. He's referred to this book several times. You can get it through your dealers. You just need to ask them if they do not have it in stock to please order it from R&K, and it's called Destined to Digitize. And the book will not teach you how to use your software. It will teach you the rules of digitizing no matter what software you're using.
Although, you know what, I'll add at this point, Kathy, that I'm working on a series of videos now that are software specific to the book.
Great.
I am halfway through with it now. Very soon there will be a series of videos available for those who own Embroidery Suite where it coincides with the book. I will take you through the software and teach you every aspect within the software that I teach in the book.
That is great, because before I ever had anything to do with Floriani, before we ever had software, I got a copy of Walter's book, and I realized I had taught software usage for 12 years, but all I knew was how to use the tools. Nobody had ever taught us in the home market the rules. And his book will teach you the absolute rules of digitizing.
You know what, Kat, the point is this, that what the book is actually just simple embroidery engineering. Once I realized years ago, because folks, what I teach and what my book is called the measurement theory of embroidery creation. Once I realized the process was measurable, it opened up a world to embroidery like never before. How we made embroidery before I had developed that, and it's not that I think that highly of myself. The way that we made embroidery prior to my book was what I call, or what I show in the class, was hand-eye coordination. Once I realized it was measurable, it took all the secrets out of the process. Folks, once you learn to measure embroidery, first of all, again, the rules that I teach are the rules that every master digitizer shares. I don't care if it's Zunt, if it was my father, if it's me, if it was DJ, if it was any master digitizer that I know. We all follow the rules that I do teach in that book. But to some extent, like I've shown you a little bit, folks, the software is based on that. Your angles, your densities are superseded and controlled to some extent within the software. But it's still good to know that. I thank you, Kathy. I wasn't looking for a great plug on that, but the book does mean a lot to me. And this software is my heart, and it is my soul. It's everything I know about embroidery, and I'm trying to automate it as much as we can. But there is an aspect of understanding. And that's why what I'm going through right now, it's rudimentary, absolutely. But embroidery is simple. It's simple. It's repetitive. It's 3 stitch types with simple rules and 6 combinations of stitches with even simpler rules. I can't stress that enough.
And Walt, we've got a question. Would you go over the Save to Sew again, all of your options in Save to Sew? Would you explain that again?
Absolutely. You know what? I guess it's best defined. Let me go ahead and I'm going to bring up this design. I mean, I work with this design an amazing amount, but we're going to go ahead and just do this. If I digitize this design within the software, and I'll go through the sequences I'm digitizing, but let me go ahead and just get this done real quick. And I'm not even going to do the whole part of it. I'm just going to do a couple of aspects. We'll just digitize this fill stitch here. Let me turn off the needle penetration points, and then I'm just going to grab the satin stitch. I'm sorry, I like to change the colors. I like to have the correct colors on the screen. Let's let that digitize, okay? Okay, if I've digitized this within the software, what I just did, folks, is I used the auto-digitizing aspect of the software that I call segmented auto-digitizing. So if I've digitized in this method, the fact is that, and I'll go ahead and get rid of the graphic and I'll zoom in, there is no overlap to the stitches. So basically that's telling you I'm really not that well digitized. Yes, it was simply digitized within the software, but auto-digitizing adds no overlap. So when I hit File and Save to Sew, my choice is always going to be, no matter what material type I select, even Batiste, it's going to be Magic Wand. The selection of Magic Wand, you're telling the software, I have no overlap, okay? So now when I process it through Save to Sew, it's going to tell me how to stabilize it. I can't tell you again how much I love that feature within the software. But when I hit Finish and I come in and I measure, you'll see that the overlaps that have been added are my measurement theory numbers or greater. The choice of Magic Wand, you're telling the software, I have no overlap or very minimal overlap. When I bring up a design, and I'll go ahead and bring up this design right here. I use this a lot in my classes also. And I come in and I measure overlaps. Here in the green I have a fill stitch next to a fill stitch, so I measure that overlap, 5 or 6 tenths. here a fill stitch next to a satin. I measure that overlap at 6/10. You know what? That's actually telling me before I run that design. And also, the satin stitch width here is 8/9 of a millimeter. It's telling me I'm going to get a gap here. I'm going to get a gap here. So if I use Save to Sew now, File, and Save to Sew, my choice is going to be basically I digitized it. What I find with most new digitizers, and this is a hard thing to call, and I do have some videos coming out on this, but when you choose I digitized, you're basically saying I have overlap, but not enough. So when I hit next, apply, and yes, what it's going to add as far as overlap is a sufficient amount now. Once again, fill next to a fill. I've got 1.2. Fill next to a satin, 1.4. Minimum satin stitch width, 1.4, 1.7. The choice of I digitized it, basically you're telling the software, you know what, I've overlapped, but not enough. And then the final choice in Save to Sew, and I'll bring up my Columbine design, and we'll zoom to it here. And I come in and I measure this. Before I ever run this design, I measure this overlap. Well, my overlap is 2 millimeters there. This is a well-digitized design. So when I hit File and Save to Sew, my choice is always going to be, I didn't digitize. I didn't digitize is actually telling the software, I'm a well-digitized design. Because now when I hit Next, Apply, and Yes, it adds the least amount of value of overlap and underlay to the process. So boom, and there you go. It's added very little width. It's added very little overlap. My overlap was 2. It's still right at that 2, took it up to about 2.1. It added very minimal overlap. So the choices again in Save to Sew. The choice of Magic Wand means I have no overlap. The choice of I digitized, you're telling the software I have overlap but not enough. The choice of I didn't digitize, you're actually telling the software I'm a very well digitized design. Actually, DJ and I are in discussions about this because our wording on this, it's hard. I don't want to really put not well digitized, pretty well digitized, really well digitized, but we're going to clear that up. I do have videos coming out with that. I thought that was an important aspect to bring up during this class with that I'm giving right now.
Okay, Walter, and the one last question I have is, when you showed the fill next to a fill, I noticed one fill is going vertically and the other is going horizontally. What if both your fills are going the same direction?
That's such a great question. Because of the natural pull of the fill stitch, I would overlap 2 fills going in the same direction, a millimeter on both sides. I would allow for the natural pull, which is 3 to 5/10, and I would add another 5/10. So I would add 1 millimeter to each side of the fill going in the same directions. So if I were to digitize 2 fills, and let me go ahead and I'll do it for you. Let me just zoom in here. So I have 1 fill. Right here, we'll make them junction right at the same point. And then let's grab another color. Oops, excuse me. Where'd you go? I'll make another fill. Two fills, same direction at the junction point. Now again, here's a wonderful value to the grid being set to 1.4 millimeters because you can still see the grid behind there. But if I select this first one and I come down here, I'm going to increase this overlap, and that would be about a millimeter right there. And then as I grab the second one, okay, I'm going to grab this one and I'm going to pull about a millimeter on this side. See, the grid for me at this point in time allows me to do my own overlap without even going to pull and push. I could have absolutely done it in pull and push by choosing left side, right side, because on one side I'm going to have 1. See, to the outside I have 5/10, but at the junction point I've actually overlapped these now over 2 millimeters. Why? Because I have a natural pull of 3 to 5/10, a natural pull of the blue to 3 to 5/10. I want that additional 1 millimeter in there so that I don't get gapping in between. Very seldom two fills next to each other till we run the same direction? Let me explain. Because two fills run in the same direction at the junction point, you get a blend of stitches. The stitches fall into each other and you don't get a straight line of stitching, okay? I'll give you one hint. If you're running two fills in the same direction, okay, you always want into the underlay, utilize your what we call edge walk underlay, which is your contour underlay, because that edge walk underlay, as this fill begins to pull back, you've created a line of stitching there where that stitch, where these pull stitches, as this blue stitch pulls in, you've got a line of stitching underneath that actually lofts it and will help create two clean lines. So in both elements, I would put an edge walk underlay under both of them. That will allow two fills to go in the same direction and create a line. I can take you folks so deep into this, and we will. I foresee in the future such an advanced learning curve. The software's been out X amount of years now. Some of you are getting so good with it. I think you're ready for some really advanced classes, and we're going to bring that to you. I promise you that, folks. We got a lot to teach you, and I still got a lot to learn myself, but I've got a lot to teach you, and I look forward to it.
Great. Walter, I do want to tell everybody that this webinar will be posted on our new webinar page. You go to our Floriani software website, scroll down to where it says webinars. It takes us a couple, 3 weeks in between webinars to get them up and posted, but everybody has been asking, what if we miss a webinar? How can we review a webinar? Well, we are now posting the webinars. Go to florianisoftware.com, scroll down to your webinars, and you can now view the webinars over and over. So we're real proud of that, and it's been a long time coming, but we finally got that up for everyone.
Yeah, and you know what? I'll add that as we say that too, occasionally we're still going to have some technical difficulties. When DJ and I lost power, a couple of webinars, we lost that recording. So we still might have an occasional issue with that, but bear with us, folks. We're doing everything we can to bring you what Kathy just said, and we are very, very excited about that.
Well, we are at time, Walter, and we're going to need to tell everybody good night.
Well, you know what? I would like to just cover, Kathy, and I understand that, but I would just
okay.
For just a couple of other very quick aspects, and I know I'm going over, but I'm going to take 5 minutes, folks, and I'm sorry, but once I get started, you all know me, I don't want to stop. But I just want to explain to you that when you digitize, and I'm going to just give you some initial very, very simple rules, okay? The first rule when you digitize is also, and I'm going to go ahead and just fit the window and bring the graphic back up on the screen, but the very first rule when you all digitize, I want you to understand is finished size. When you bring your graphic in, the first thing that I want you to all understand is set your finished size. Why? Because only when you're working on the finished size of an embroidery design will you be able to determine the proper stitch type. So, bring your graphic on the screen. You'll have your backdrop screen up here on the right. Set your finished size. Once again, I'm set metrically. You can right-click over here on the margin, change it to inches. It's now set in inches. It's a 3-inch embroidery design. Set the size that you want. Only when you're working on the finished size will you be able to determine the proper stitch type. Then digitizing, folks, is nothing more than grabbing your ruler, measuring the element in Floriani software to determine stitch type. With determined stitch type, I normally go back to metric at this point, but I measure. So here it's telling you it's a fill stitch. I come here and measure, and it's telling me it's a satin stitch. The orange I measure, and it's telling me it's a satin stitch. You simply measure with the software, and it's a satin stitch. But here's the point I was trying to make. This is a fill stitch. It's next to a satin stitch. This is a satin stitch next to another satin stitch. The same here. It's a satin stitch next to a satin stitch. Well, it's a flower. But you know what? I bring up another design, and I come in, and I've already set the finished size on this, but I again measure. Well, I have a fill stitch here. I'm next to a satin stitch, okay? The fact is that, yes, I have a flower design here, but I have a fill next to a satin. I have a diamond here. It's a fill next to a satin. The point is a fill next to a satin is always a fill next to a satin. in the flower, a satin next to a satin is always a satin next to a satin. Don't look at designs, folks, as what that design might be. It's simply a stitch type, and it's what it's sitting next to. My point is, once you learn how to put the stitch types next to the other stitch types correctly, it never changes. A fill next to a satin is always a fill next to a satin. A satin next to a satin is always a satin next to a satin, and on and on. It's repetitive. It's an easy process. You can all digitize. There's nothing to it. This was our first very rudimentary aspects of digitizing within the software. The controls are in here. They're up in your properties box in every element that you have. You have absolute control of pull and push and underlay, mostly controlled by Save to Symbol. We've automated it as much as we can for you, but it is important that you understand these rules. With that being said, I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'm sorry I went over. I want to just keep going is how I feel right now. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you, support staff. Thank you, my moderators. Thank you, all of you who own the software. I love you all so very much. Hugs and stitches. We'll see you next time.